All right, so in this video, we're gonna talk about the 3 different ways of implementing CSS into our web project. We're gonna bring back the absolute versus relative file path project we started in the HTML video series. And I'm gonna just talk about these 3 concepts of internal, external, and inline. And so here is a quick definition of all 3. But let me just bring back up our web project and do an example of each way here. And so here's our code from the HTML video series, where we began to give structure to this HTML document that you see here. And like I said, in this video series, we're going to finish off coding this 1-page PDF here. And like I said, a whole process that we're taking here is to take everything that you see here in this PDF and convert it into a website. All right, so let's go ahead and pull up our editor, and I just want to quickly demonstrate the 3 different ways of implementing CSS. So the first one here, we already kind of put kind of a comment here in our header of our site, and basically this is internal CSS, what I have highlighted here on line 14. With internal CSS, it's page specific, right? You can only style one page, and then the style HTML tag goes within the head of your website because it's going to communicate information about your site. And and so here, between the opening and closing style tag is where our CSS style rules would go. So for instance, if I wanted to include a style rule here, let's say I'm going to use a type selector, and I'm going to select this HTML element called body. And so in CSS, that's the type selector. So I'll say body. And the syntax here is open and closing bracket. And I'm just going to give it one declaration. I'll give it 2 declarations. I'm going to say margin. I'll say auto. And then I'm going to give it a width. And I say width of 1,000 pixels. And what this does here is it actually centers my website. So watch what happens here when I actually save this. And I go ahead and render my website. So I'll right click, open in Chrome. And you'll see that it's centered. And so right click, and if I inspect here, bring up the Google Developer Chrome tools here, you'll see that now my my code is saved to the source code, but then it's applying this one style rule of body, and it gave it a margin of auto and gave it a width of 1,000 pixels. So if I take that off, essentially that uncenters my website. Anyway, more to come on that, and I'll talk more about how to center your website, but you'll see that now my site is centered within the browser. But like I said, the focus of this video is going to be on implementing CSS. And so the one implementation method that we just did here is called internal. Let's go on to the next one here, which is, go back to our slide deck. So that's internal CSS. You use the style tags, and that style tag typically goes within the head of your website. Let's look at the external method here. The external method, you're going to actually use the link tag, and you're going to link to an external CSS document. So let's bring up our editor. And what I'm going to do here is I've already created a style.css sheet. And so if you haven't done that, go ahead and create a style.css sheet. I'm going to put a link to this example in our class GitHub account, and so or our class site. And so if you don't catch all this code, no worries, you'll have access to all this code after we review it in class here. So here I already have the style.css sheet, and this is where I'll begin to place my style rules. And so if I wanted to, I can take the style rule here of body, and I can get rid of it internally, and I could place it here. And if I save it, I'm going to save the style.css file, and I'm going to save it in an HTML file. But now that I have an external document, I have to successfully use this link tag to reference this external CSS style sheet. And so I gave it the relative file path for the href attribute, but notice that I used the link tag instead of the style tag. And this is where, because I'm linking to an external resource, and this is just the syntax or the element that I have to use to retrieve the style sheet. Then here I have a few other attributes like the rel, which is the relationship, style sheet, the type, which basically describes what type of document this is, and it's essentially a CSS document. And so if I save this, everything should still, my site should still be centered within the browser. So I just press Control S, and I want to go back to my site, and I press refresh. You'll see that my site is still rendering. But notice here when my mouse is hovering, it's coming from the style.css document. If I click on that, it'll take me to the style.css document in my file structure, which is here, and it only has one style rule located within that document. All right, last but not least here is Inline. And Inline is tag specific. And by the way, external is web project specific, so it can style any particular web page that has that link. And this is beneficial because when you're done with your final project, you want to make sure that all your code is in an external document. It's going to save you time because you can style multiple documents with one CSS file. So all you have to do is just include the link tag within the head, and guess what? Voila. All of your documents are styled the same because it's all referencing the same style sheet. Inline is tag specific, where it only applies to a tag. Again, internal is page specific, external is project specific, and inline is tag specific. Let me do a quick example of that. So with inline, let's go here to our paragraph tag, and when you're doing inline, I'm gonna put a comment here. You have to use what we call a style attribute. So with a style attribute, it takes the same syntax as every attribute. You have the name of the attribute, and then you have the opening and closing quotation. And then what goes in between the open and closing quotation is going to be your properties or your declarations. And so in here, I'm going to say font weight, and I'll just say bold, right? And then just so that you can actually see that change take place, I'll say Control S, and then here I'll go back to my document, and well, not that document, I'll refresh, but right now I'm not going to refresh, but you'll see that here it's not bolded. But if I refresh, you'll see that now that text is bolded. But if I right click and inspect here, you'll see that that was saved to my source code, and the inline CSS is applied to the open and p tag, and it's basically making this text bold. So that's a quick review of the 3 different ways of implementing CSS into your document. Now there is another way that your document receives CSS, but it's not necessarily by the developer. Every browser has its own internal style sheet. And so if most browsers, you will see that it's called a user agent style sheet, and that's essentially the style sheet that every browser has, and that style sheet applies a default CSS to your document. And our job here is to override that and to create our own style, and not necessarily have the browser dictate or apply its own style to our document. So we'll talk about CSS reset and how to override the browser in a later video, but just know that there is another aspect to this, and that's the user agent style sheet or the browser style sheet that is typically that travels with every browser that gives style to our documents as well.